Welcome to Fan Counters. My name's Nick, and Elizabeth is off again this week. But when she returns next week, she can tell you why she's been gone so much. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we tape quite a few shows on single days. So that is part of the reason. We are all over social media on Facebook. You can find us by searching Fan Counters. You can also follow our Twitter page at Fan Counters Live. And if you wouldn't mind sharing our posts with your friends, retweeting us, all of that is very helpful in gaining new listeners, keeping the podcast fresh with content because you guys are taking your time to email us, and we really do appreciate that. Now, we've been able to keep this podcast ad-free. We've had sponsors approach us who've wanted to put their ads on the program. It's not really the direction we're looking to go. So what we've come up with is a solution that other podcasts use that's very successful. Think about how many magazine subscriptions you have. I have at least 4 coming to my house. Most of them are for the kids. But still, 4 subscriptions that I pay for. Think of a podcast like a subscription. Now, this isn't going to be mandatory. Our podcast will always be free. But if you would, think about donating a monthly amount, $1, $5, $10 or more, to our podcast. It certainly would help with our production costs, Elizabeth's gas money, things like that. So if you wouldn't mind, go to patreon.com. That's patreon.com, patreon.com/fan counters. And you can donate any amount that you want, really. Everything will help. And we do appreciate your support of the Fan Counters podcast. On the show this week, I've got Brett Ryback. He is an amazing writer, actor, composer, and lyricist. You might know Brett from his appearances on Mom, Modern Family, How I Met Your Mother, House, and All In with Cam Newton. Now, Brett is an award-winning writer and most recently was commissioned to write music and additional lyrics for the children's musical Nate the Great. I recently took my 6-year-olds to see Nate the Great and was very impressed not only on the storyline and the message, but the music was something that you keep singing weeks after the performance. Thanks a lot, Brett. Among many awards that Brett has received, he has to be the most proud of winning the 2016 ASCAP Foundation Cole Porter Award. His other theater works include Passing Through, Joe Schmo Saves the World, and the Just a Little Critter musical, which my kids and I also went and saw. And again, more music that just gets in your head and you keep singing it and you're like, why am I singing these kids' tunes? Well, today you're going to get into the mind of this creative genius. And we are bringing you Brett Ryback.
Coming to you from nowhere near the entertainment capital of the world, this is Fan Counters with Nick and Elizabeth on the PodFix network.
There was this mob of people, and they're screaming my name.
Crazy fans.
Stop following me. Don't come around my house. If you do, the cops are going to be at yours.
If I'm having dinner with my wife, don't sit down at my table. Don't follow me into the bathroom.
Can I take a picture? We're going to, oh my God.
I think this guy wants to fight me. Ended up being a fan.
I'm the only one that's ever been on Sam Jackson and lived to tell about it.
Well, guess what? I have a big surprise for you.
That's why we call it Fan Counters.
I don't think they're going to last on the air very long.
Brett Ryback, welcome to Fan Counters. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, one of the best things that we get to do on Fan Counters is we bring in successful people on our show, and we get to hear about how they went from like small town America to doing some big things in the entertainment world. So it's fair to mention to our audience that you're a Wisconsin guy. You went to school with my sister-in-law, Amy. So after you graduate from a Milwaukee high school, did you immediately move to LA for college?
I did, yeah. I went to UCLA right away after graduating, and I studied music composition there. So I moved right to Los Angeles.
So music probably was your first interest, or did you act before you had moved out there?
I had started acting when I was 5 years old. In fact, the first place that I worked was at First Stage in Milwaukee. And I did many shows with them when I was in grade school. And then I started working with some other companies in Milwaukee, eventually Milwaukee Rep, Milwaukee Chamber Theater, Skylight. So I did a lot of acting when I was young. And I came to music. My mom was musical, so I was always around music. She was a singer, and we had a piano in the house.
Okay.
But I remember my sister took lessons when I was younger. She took piano lessons, and I was sort of afraid of her piano teacher. And so my mom asked me if I wanted to take lessons, and I sort of was like, no, I don't want to do that. But then when I was around 9 or 10, I just had an interaction with a young friend of mine, and she introduced me to the concept of reading chords.
Okay.
And so then I sort of started going through all the sheet music that we had of musical theater stuff, and going, oh my God, there's all these chords, and suddenly I could play all this music. And then after that, my mom started taking me to a different piano teacher, Jack Wilson, who's still an artist in Milwaukee. And it was through him that I really developed my ability to write music and to play the piano, obviously. And so when it came time to deciding to go to college, I was looking at the possibility of studying acting at school, but he recommended that because I had been acting for pretty much all of my childhood,
Mm-hmm.
that I go to school to study something new and to learn a different skill, and which was music, he recommended music. And so I made that choice, and it was a really smart, prudent choice because it diversified me in a very important way. So it just gave me more options, I think, than I might have had otherwise.
Were you doing any acting as a way to make money while you were in college, or did you have to work your way through?
Yeah, I did work my way through, but I wasn't acting. I worked for a little while. I worked at a Borders bookstore, and then I worked in the music library at UCLA. And then I also started, I actually did quite a fair bit of music directing while I was in school. I would, for various, smaller companies in LA. And I was acting though at college. I would do shows, both in the music school, we did musicals, and then I did some projects with the film department. And so I was, but then right after school, I got a job at a theater company in Laguna Beach, California. And so I had an acting job right out of school. And that kind of kicked off my career from there.
Okay. We're going to talk about a couple of these acting projects in a bit, but I want to kind of go into your writing. Now, and I want to clarify, are you writing just like lyrics for shows, or were you writing plays and all of that stuff early on?
Yeah, I did it all, and I still do it all. It depends on the collaboration, but right now, normally the situation that I find myself in is I'm writing music and lyrics, or sometimes just the music for projects. But I have written projects, especially when it's something that I'm doing by myself, where I will also write what's called the book of the musical, which is the structure and the dialogue in between the scenes and songs. I'll write the book, music and lyrics. There's been situations in the past where I've just written the book, and then I have written plays as well. So that's just not non-musical, pieces of drama. So I've had my hand in many different aspects of writing for theater.
So do you remember early on how you kind of refined your writing skills? And is it different than how you work to get better now?
Yes and no. Early on, I think a lot of my education came from listening to a lot of musicals, reading, certainly as far as music, reading lots of different kinds of music and playing lots of different kinds of music, imitating. A lot of writers and composers in particular learn their craft by imitation, because it is a craft, and so it's something you can teach, and you can teach the fundamentals of, and there's theory behind music, but there's a certain element of apprenticeship that happens, and so you learn by copying the masters, the people that came before you. And then from there, you start to find your own voice and find your own tools. So, yeah, a lot of the education that I had early on was just immersing myself in the different forms. And because musical theater was the thing that I was most drawn to. That was what I really loved to listen to, and I would go and watch musicals, and I would buy the scores to musicals and play through them. And then my piano teacher would try to sneak in some Bach and some Debussy and some Mozart. And so I, had a little bit of a well-rounded education. And then when I got to college, obviously from there, it became a little more formalized. And I had my music theory classes, and I had my orchestration classes, and I had my, my conducting classes and my music history classes. And so that started to kind of round out my understanding of what I did. But it's funny because I have a vivid memory of having graduated from college, and for a few years after that, feeling like I had lost a little bit of that kind of raw spark, because I was so by the rules, because I had learned all the rules now in college, and so I was very much following the rules. And there was kind of a moment in my life where I was initially going to be writing the book and lyrics for a project, and then the composer dropped out and suggested that I do the composition. And I felt a little overwhelmed by that prospect, but I thought, well, okay, I'll give it a shot. And in kind of re-immersing myself rather in the composition of it, I started to figure out how to break all the rules again, and to get back in touch with what my instincts were as a young composer before I knew any better. But I had the education behind it, so I could I felt more empowered to break the rules, and more empowered to follow my instincts, as opposed to just sort of flailing about in the dark. So, then to answer the second part of the question about how do I refine myself now, I'm always trying to listen to new shows, see what else other people are doing, and see how other artists are creating work. And I do a lot of reading, both about writing and about the craft of storytelling and different kinds of storytelling, TV scripts, film scripts, just general, there's a book called Story that is just about the structure of how stories work. I remember I read Stephen King's book on writing, just trying to get a lot of information about how other writers work and things like that. And then, just doing it, it's not a spectator sport. So you gotta be on the ground doing it, and failing.
Dive in and just start.
Trial and error.
A lot of rewrites probably.
Yeah.
So when you're writing a play or a musical or really any project, is there a hook for you that really gets that project started? And is it based on something like a personal experience or something you saw in real life or a specific character you had in mind? What sparks something for you?
That's a good question. I think it depends, because right now there's a couple different, there are ideas that I have that are sort of original ideas that aren't necessarily based on anything. And then there's the stuff that I'm writing that is based on stuff. And I guess the difference between the two things is that when I'm inspired to write something that isn't necessarily based on something, it's usually a core idea. There's a core sort of question or theme that attracts me that I want to explore, and so then I will find the right characters to explore that and the right circumstances to allow them to explore that. One of the examples of that is I have a piece called Joe Schmo Saves the World, which is about the role of young people creating art in the world. And that was inspired by something that had happened in my life that I was frustrated about. And then at the same time, the Arab Spring happening in the Middle East, and the two things kind of merged in my head. And I thought, this would be an interesting thing to explore. Now, I didn't necessarily have the plot. And I didn't necessarily know who the characters were that were going to help me explore this. And so it took quite a few years to really kind of flesh that out. But then that's different from, adapting something like, my show Passing Through, or even Little Critter, or Nate the Great. And when I'm doing that, I really have to understand what is the overarching journey or character development that is going to be expressed through this, so that gives me a sense of a beginning, a middle, and an end, that I really understand where I'm taking this character, especially when I'm doing the music. I think because music is so tied to emotion, I really have to know, well, what is the emotional journey that the audience is going to go on, and that's tied to what is the journey that the main character is going to go on. And if I can identify that for myself within the piece, then I can, even if it's just a kernel, I can say, okay, I know my way into this piece. There have been other ideas or projects that, have been brought to me or come my way, and I look at it and I go, I just don't know that I can't connect deeply enough to what the experience of this character is, and I don't know that he's going on enough of a journey for me to really develop something here. And so then that doesn't really appeal to me.
So you've got a lot of these ideas, and I feel like as a writer myself, I have a lot of things I feel like I want to write about. How many pieces of work do you think that are either in your head, maybe they're not even on paper yet, or how many are on paper that haven't been published? Do you have a lot of stuff that you're just kind of lying around that you're constantly working on?
I don't think that there's anything necessarily that I would say I'm constantly working on. I'm pretty good at, when I have a project, I will finish it.
Okay.
That doesn't always mean that it's going to get produced or published. I have some pieces that, certainly some early plays in my career that, have never made it beyond readings. I have some musicals more recently in my career that have been sort of workshopped and maybe done at a college level, but haven't necessarily been produced professionally. And then there's the massive file on my computer, which is the idea. It's like my ideas drawer.
Okay.
And it's kind of half-baked, premises or things that are sort of the beginnings of an idea that I guess by just writing them down, I know that they're always there, and I will, sometimes I'll revisit them, but I rarely feel fully motivated to dive back into them for whatever reason. Except there are a few ideas that I have had in my head for a while now that I know I want to do something with, and I just haven't found the rest of the plot or the sort of right, story to hang the idea on. But there are a couple things that I know that I will eventually figure out how to explore, because they're important to me. And they're not going to go away, and they're not going to, it's never going to be something that's going to run out of time.
I want to talk about some of your recent work. A couple weeks ago, I took my twin girls, they're 6, and we went and saw Nate the Great, and it was a show that you wrote songs for. So I was wondering if you could take a few moments, tell me a little bit about the show. How did that project come to you, and then how far along was everything when you got it?
So Nate the Great is what's called a TYA, which is Theater for Young Audience musical. And it's based on the book series by Marjorie Charmette about a boy detective. And our story focuses kind of primarily around the first book in her series, where his best friend Annie has a painting that goes missing, and it could have been stolen by her dog Fang, her friend Rosamond, or her little brother Harry. Mm-hmm. And Nate goes on the journey to solve the case. And there's a lot of pancakes, because Nate's favorite food is pancakes.
And there's a great pancake song in there, yeah.
Yes, yeah. And you asked me, how did it come to me? So the man that I wrote it with is named John McClay. He wrote the book, and we collaborated on the lyrics. And we had written a project before. I met John when I was an actor in Milwaukee. He used to run a company called the Milwaukee Shakespeare Company. And I did a show with them right as I was graduating high school. And so we met then, and then John went on to become an associate at First Stage. And he, maybe 5 years ago now, had seen some of my work done at a different venue in Milwaukee at Skylight, and came to the artistic director and said, hey, we ought to, bring Brett in and kind of invest in him. And so we then collaborated on Just a Little Critter musical.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a successful collaboration for the two of us and for the company. And so we decided we wanted to do another show together. And I had a connection with a company in California called South Coast Rep. And so I brought them into the fold with First Stage, and together with John and my agent, we looked for available properties that would be interesting to both of the companies. Because one of the things with TYA musicals, or TYA theater, I should say, is it's important that the titles are either curricular based, things that the students are reading in schools, or that are just really, really popular with young people. And so you kind of have to find the right sorts of properties, and that can be tricky to do. But we lucked out, and Nate was available, and both of the companies really were interested in it. So we had them commission us to write the piece for both of their theater companies. And when I came to it, John had written a draft over the course of a summer of the play with some lyrics in it. It was pretty loose, and we had a lot of conversations while he was kind of sussing it all out. He would call me up and say, so this is what I'm thinking of, and I would kind of spitball and say, oh, I'm interested in that. That sounds interesting, or, oh, that might be a cool thing. And before I had read the actual book that the thing was based on, I read John's script, because it's important to me that I understand in that sort of collaboration, well, what is it that John is interested in exploring, and what stands out to me about what John is wanting to do? Because ultimately the book itself is very short. It's very, limited writing, and so it was interesting to me to see what it was that appealed to John about how he wanted to tell the story. And so from there, I then had a conversation with him and said, okay, here's what I'm responding to. Here's where I think we can flesh this out more. Mm-hmm. Let's do, what if we do this with these characters? And what if, I feel like we need another plot point here, and I think another song needs to go here, and, and all that sort of stuff. And so then he kind of completed a draft maybe at I want to say the end of August. And then I had it for a month, and I started writing some new lyrics and music to the songs. And it took me about a month to do that, the month of September, which was September last year. And so then a year later, we were in rehearsals.
Wow, that seems really fast to kind of get that off the ground.
It is pretty fast.
You were already working with two theaters, so that does make sense.
That's exactly right, yes. So when you have that sort of support and the infrastructure and not just the deadline, but the actual we're going to have this produced, it helps to motivate. And, and they only pay you when you give them a draft. So you want to get a draft done as quickly as possible.
Right. Now, Nate the Great only has half dozen characters in it. So does having fewer personalities to work with, does it make it harder or maybe even easier to make them very compelling for the audience?
I think it's different for everybody, but for me, I tend to do better with smaller character plays, because I really like to invest in each of the characters, and I really like to give them journeys and give them arcs to go on as much as I can. Mm-hmm. And not that I've done a few things where there's like an ensemble of people, and I but honestly, it's not my go-to instinct, and so it's a little more challenging for me to write shows that require bigger choruses and that sort of thing, because I think a little more character based. So I'm interested in who these people are and where they're going to go, and I don't want to waste any actor's time being a part of something. So yeah.
Okay.
I tend to gravitate towards smaller shows. It is easier for me to tell their story.
What I love about First Stage, and probably many children's theaters, is they have questions, like pre-show and post-show questions to ask. And one of the questions in the program was to ask your kids after the show about, it was a question about Rosamund. Now, the question struck me because it refers to her as somebody who is strange because of her appearance. Now, I didn't really think that she had a strange appearance. She wore black, but that's not typically unusual. And I'm only bringing this character up in particular because you have mentioned previously that she's your favorite character. So tell us why it was so fun to work with the character of Rosamund.
Yeah, so Rosamund in our play, I'll say, because she's similar in the books, but I think we've fleshed her out a little differently in the play. But she is this kind of darker character. She surrounds herself with all these black cats, which she calls the hexes, and it's just sort of, I think in the book she is somewhat described as being strange, and I don't remember if they exactly specify that, other than she's sort of not a recluse necessarily, but just sort of keeps to herself. She's probably more introverted. I think that's probably what the Marjorie was initially describing.
Okay.
But what interested me about her and why I love her in our play so much is, I think on the page anyway, it's interesting because you saw it at first stage where they have kids as playing the kids. I'm now working on a production with adults playing all the parts.
Oh.
So it's very interesting. The types of acting levels that you can just kind of discuss in an adult rehearsal are different. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think is there on the page with Rosamund is that she's a very complicated individual. She has deep feelings, sort of, they're not as expected. She zigs maybe when everybody zags. And in the writing of her, she sings a song called The Hexes. And I remember when John first sent me an early draft of the lyric to that song, it just had the phrase, the hexes, I call my cats the hexes. And that, even the way I said it, it has a sort of natural rhythm to it. The hexes, I call my cats the hexes. And it just struck me as such an interesting way of a rhythmic way of speaking. And so and the word the hexes has such a fun sound to it.
Yep.
And I thought, oh my goodness, there's probably, we could come up with a lot of really fun rhymes for that. And so I told him that, and I said, I see her, having this sort of talk-singy quality, and so could you write some more rhymes with that? And so he came back with a few more, and I had even more that I wanted to add to that. And so suddenly she, there's this character, she's extremely verbose. There's a lot of internal rhymes that are very quick and clever. And then when she had the second song on the show, You Can Do It, I wanted to continue that style of singing for the character. And that gave me another opportunity to use all these kind of quick, fun rhymes. And I don't think that is something that shows up a lot in children's theater, is something that's really complicated, that really makes you listen in, and is sort of comedic in how offbeat she is. And so to me, all of that is what made her kind of a fascinating thing. I think that she's unique in the children's theater canon. And part of that is also because there's something very old school musical theater about her. There's something almost vaudevillian about her, certainly in the way that she sings. And that is something that I enjoy about getting to write children's theater, is that it's an opportunity to share my passion for musical theater and my love, the things that struck me when I was growing up that I used to geek out over in musical theater, and put those into shows that, that other young people are going to see and hopefully, fall in love with as well. So that's why she's my favorite character in the show.
Nate the Great is very well done. Congratulations on that show. Another show that we saw, you bet, that was wildly successful is Just a Little Critter, the musical. Now, it was a show that my kids also loved. In the Little Critter book series, I remember from my childhood, was that entire musical something you created based off of one book or many of those books?
That was, I want to say, I think it was 5 or 6 of the books in the series.
Okay.
So each, I remember them from my childhood as well. And, the books are very simple. They're for very young kids. And so they kind of just deal with one event, just Little Critter goes to the city. Just Little Critter has a younger sister. Just a Little Critter goes to bed.
Yep.
And so what John McClay did with that show is he took about 6 of the books, and those kind of became each of the songs, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
And then those, we kind of used them as tent poles to craft the rest of our story. And the main thrust of the story was a book where Little Critter gets a little sister. And so it's really about, and what I really enjoyed about that, and I think this was a little subtly put in the show, but was something that I thought was kind of a fun thing for us to flip on its head, was, at the beginning of the show, Little Critter sings a song called, if I was bigger.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't want to be Little Critter. He wants to be Big Critter. As a lot of kids, they don't want to be treated like little kids. I want to be a big boy.
Right.
And then little sister shows up, and, and there's some conflict that ensues because he has to share his life with a new sibling. But then at the end of the show, he realizes that in relationship to little sister, he is Big Critter because
Right.
he's the big brother. And so that moment is, I found to be very sweet. And he comforts her, she's going to bed, and he comforts her by telling her the story of this superhero that he has created for himself. So, it's a simple story, but and from simple books, but hopefully has a nice, heartwarming journey in it.
Well, that's the thing. Both these shows have good messages for the kids, and
yeah,
it drives different things home. And it was kind of neat to see it at the time we did because, like we talked about, my sister-in-law Amy was expecting another baby, and she already had 2 kids. So we had hoped that they would come with us, because once we saw it, we're like, that was a perfect show for them to see with a new baby on the way. But still, it was really a fun show.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Before we talk about some of your television work, are there other theatrical projects that you've written or produced that you want to kind of mention here?
I think the only other thing I want to mention is I'm working on a new type of musical project right now that I'm really excited about. It's a musical podcast.
Ah.
And it's, I'm a big fan of podcasts. I, especially living in LA and driving a lot,
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of time in my car. I was listening to a podcast recently called S-Town. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
I've not.
It came out, maybe a year and a half ago. It was by the same people who did Serial.
Okay.
And anyway, I was inspired listening to it because it was a documentary, but it was so bizarre. And it sounded, I kept thinking to myself during the first couple episodes, I was like, this can't be real. Somebody has made this up and is just telling it to me as though it's real. That wasn't the case. It is real, but it just felt so written. And I thought, well, why couldn't somebody write one and actually do what I thought that they were doing? And the man who created it had been inspired by literature, specifically like Faulkner, Southern Gothic novels. And so he used that form to structure the way that the story was told. And part of that was that the main character of the story was a talker. And so he had these long, varied monologues of just like, he would go all over the place, and they were almost like arias or songs. And so listening to it, it felt very musical to me. And I thought, I want to create a musical version of what this is. And so I got a couple collaborators together in LA, and we started coming up with an idea and fleshing it out over the course of about a year. And we are almost finished. We just finished demoing the first episode of a 5-episode series. And so we're going to hopefully be releasing everything next fall. That's the plan right now. But it's called In Strange Woods. So something to look forward to.
Let's talk about television. Kind of excited about this. You were in one of my favorite shows, at least an episode of it, Modern Family.
Yep.
So were these appearances booked by an agent? Did you get them through networking? Like this particular one, how did that come about?
So Modern Family came about through my network. I am very close with one of the writers of the show, and my husband, who's an actor, is also on the show regularly. And so I was just sort of in the orbit of Modern Family, and there was an episode that my friend wrote, and he had sort of mentioned to me a couple months prior to it, happening, and he said, would you be interested in coming in and auditioning for this part? I have a part I think it'd be fun for you to do. And I said, absolutely. Are you kidding? And so then I came in and auditioned for it. And then they gave it to me. So but that did not come through my agent. That came through my connection to the writer.
Okay. So what was the part? Tell us about.
And something interesting about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the part is, I play a part of a younger gay couple that is at this bar where some of the family members from the show are celebrating Haley's 21st birthday. And Mitch and Cam are sort of miffed that me and my boyfriend are getting more attention by this group of like a bridesmaids party than they are, and they think it's because they're no longer hip. And so they kind of go over and want to not compete with us, but they are sort of jealous of the attention that we're getting. And what's interesting about that is the guy who plays my boyfriend in the episode is actually somebody that I went to college with, and we were good friends in college, and we just both happened to come to the project separately, and we, in the producer session audition together, we read together.
Oh, wow.
And then we both ended up getting cast. So it was really a fun day on set to get to spend it with my college buddy. And now he's on Station 19, and he's doing a lot of really great more stuff on television. Very proud.
Very cool. Now, what was that day like? Did you have any behind-the-scenes experiences that you can share, or give us some insight into what it's like to be on that set?
Yeah. I mean, it was all shot in one day, and it was on location, which is a little atypical for how they normally do the show, because normally they are on set. But they rented out this bar in Hollywood, and I'm trying to think if there's anything that was kind of interesting or unusual. The pace of those shows is really kind of in fits and spurts. There's a lot of downtime waiting around. They're setting up the camera, they're figuring out, and because they're not on set, it takes them a little bit longer to figure things out, because they're not, it's a different environment than they're used to working, and they don't have everything already set to go where they can just turn the switch on and everything's lit perfectly, right, and they know where their cameras have to be. They have to really sort of work around the space, so it took a little bit longer. And I do remember that there was I think one of the last shots of the day was being pushed and delayed because there was some helicopter situation right around the area. And so about a good hour, maybe even a little bit longer than that, they had to deal with this helicopter circling. And, you can't shoot because then you get all this awful noise in the background. And it was they had already had to do a night shoot that night for some of the other parts of the episode. And so everything just ended up getting pushed later and later. And thankfully, I didn't have to stay much beyond, I think it was like 7 or 8 at night. But they went till, 2 or 3 in the morning that evening, just finishing the shoot. So it was, it turned out to be kind of a much more intense day than I think anybody had anticipated. But no, and everybody, I knew some of the other actors that are on the show just from being around the set and being around my friend who's a writer, and it was because it was his episode. It was really special to get to be working with him, and everybody was very kind and very sweet, and it was a lot of fun.
Now, in addition to some television roles, you've also had some movie appearances. You have a credit in Hail Caesar. It was a movie that starred a myriad of people, including George Clooney. And you also had a role in a Lifetime movie, The Assistant, which featured a favorite of mine, George Stultz. So when you're on sets like this, do you ever get starstruck?
Not particularly. I think I would never say starstruck in the way that, you know, we would think about it, where it's like I can't speak, or
Right.
you know, it's like, oh my gosh, I'm so, you know, I lose myself because of because of who I'm standing with. But there is a little bit of I guess a flutter sometimes when you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm talking to so and so, or this is so bizarre. Because, and I think part of celebrity fascination is that you have such an association with somebody's face, and because you see them, whether you see them on television, you see them in magazines, or you see them on screen.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when you're actually talking to them, there's just kind of like, you enter this uncanny valley of sorts where you're just like, this is so weird. You're a person that I don't know, but I have an association to, and now I'm actually talking to you. But honestly, I'll tell you a little story about Hail Caesar, because it is kind of an unusual encounter and was a very special opportunity. I had been brought onto that project because a friend of mine was, who I had recently met in New York, was hired to be the choreographer for a couple of the sequences, but primarily this big musical dance number that Channing Tatum's character has to perform in the show.
Okay.
And on Facebook, he had, his name's Chris Catelli. Chris is the name of the choreographer. And Chris had written on Facebook, you know, hey, I'm going to be in LA. Any tap dancers want to come and play? Now, I'm not a tap dancer. I'm not a dancer at all. So but I messaged him, and I didn't know what he was talking about, but I just wanted to see him while he was here. So I said, you know, well, I'm not a tap dancer, but I'd love to play. You know, let me know what's up. And he wrote back and he said, oh, do you want to play the piano for us?
Ooh.
And I was like, oh, sure. You know, sure. What is it? And he said, well, I'm choreographing this number in a Coen Brothers film, and you know, so we need to just kind of figure out some of the choreography. And I was like, oh, awesome, sounds great. So he told me where to show up, and I sort of assumed that it was just going to be him in a studio working out the choreography with some dancers, and you know, just sort of be a very like a New York rehearsal situation, musical situation. Well, I showed up on the lot of where they were filming this movie, and what I didn't realize is at the time, very little of the sequence had actually been planned out. And so Chris was there to really figure out what was going to happen in this sequence. And so, you know, they had a keyboard set up, and I'd kind of gotten there a little early, and Chris walked in with Joel and Ethan Coen.
Wow.
And that kind of, that was pretty amazing. I was like, oh my gosh, you know, these are just kind of, you know, master filmmakers of their generation. And I did not expect that I was going to be seeing them, or let alone collaborating with them, which is kind of what it turned into, because at the time they hadn't even really, they had sort of a general idea of what the set was going to look like, but it was very dependent on what Chris was going to do with the choreography. And a piece of music had been written. I had just had a lead sheet, which is just the melody and the chords. But again, getting into the song and getting into the sequence was as of yet decided. And so the Coens kind of came in and chatted with us for a little bit, told us, you know, all right, well, here's sort of our starting ideas. So now we're going to leave you guys figure it out. And so they left, and we just spent the rest of the day pitching different ideas of, you know, well, what if he does this? And what if the guy leans on the piano and then magically hits a note? And, you know, and then Channing, maybe he's sweeping up, and, you know, and all these sorts of ideas that you now see in the film just started getting tossed around. And then later in the day, the Coens came back, and we kind of pitched them through what we had thought of. And then they responded, and, oh yeah, what about this? And what about this? And so then that was kind of a couple days of work. We just did that for about 3 or 4 days. And then it came time, as things were getting closer, they wanted to work with Channing on learning the tap stuff. And so they brought me back in to play for some of those rehearsals. And I, got to meet Chan and work with him. And he was very talented and very sweet. And I remember we were rehearsing, and the Coens came back in, and Joel is married to Frances McDormand.
Right.
And so Frances showed up, and she's like talking, she's an amazing actress herself. She's in the movie as well. But I'm just like, wow, this is crazy. This is just kind of unbelievable.
That's a little bit of a double take after double take. You're like, wait a minute,
Oh yeah, I mean, and it's just so casual because they're all collaborating, working together, and so then later on, they asked me if I wanted to be a part of the sequence and be in it, and I was thrilled to do that. And so then we're on set, and that was crazy too, just showing up to the rehearsal on the set and going, oh my God, this is, we imagined that there'd be a bell, and now there's a bell. And one of the other people had pitched the name of this place as, the Swinging Dinghy. And there was this dinghy that Channing, swings on. It was just, all these things
everything
that we
came
had
to life.
pitched to them that had now come to life, which was really exciting. And the atmosphere on the set was really very low key. It was kind of amazing because, there were a lot of ensemble sailors in that sequence, and they kind of had us housed in a separate space, but a lot of us, kind of wanted to watch them film and see what they were doing. And so we were there, we hung in the back, weren't really bothering anybody. And everybody was very low key about it. That, there are other sets where I think it would have been a little more, no, you guys have to stay here and do X, Y, and Z. But it was really casual. And I remember, blanking on his name, but he's he's the lead of it. He's the fixer in the movie. It's Josh Brolin.
Oh, okay.
And he's just kind of wandering around, just hanging out in costume, and it was just kind of this. And it's funny because the movie takes place in this in the 1950s or 40s studio system, and that's really what it felt like. It just felt like all these movie stars just kind of wandered around in different sorts of costumes. And because they were actually filming on different sound stages, you'd go in and there's the girls in in their swim outfits for the big, water number and all those sorts of things. And so it was just a really fun, crazy Hollywood experience, but very memorable. And I think the thing that struck me the most about it was just how collaborative and creative the Coens were with everybody, and willing to be with everybody. No idea was too bad to throw out, and no idea was too good to pass up. It didn't have to be their idea.
What great experiences. I mean, and that's what we talk about all the time on this show. When you get on set somewhere, or you meet somebody that you've been wanting to meet for a long time, and it actually comes true to how you had it pictured in your head, and for you, it sounds like it was even better. So that's pretty neat. From a musical movie to a musical that you have coming up in 2019. You've got a new project coming out called Passing Through, and it's actually going to make a worldwide premiere in Connecticut next year. So tell us about Passing Through.
Right. So Passing Through is a new musical based on a book called Walking to Listen by a man named Andrew Forstoffel. And the musical is written by music and lyrics I wrote, and then my collaborator is named Eric Ulloa, and he wrote the book. And it follows a young man who's kind of finds himself at a crossroads in his life after graduating from college, and decides to walk from Pennsylvania to California and gather stories from the people he meets along the way. And over the course of his trek, he sort of comes to unearth this repressed family crisis, this drama that his father had walked out on him and his mom when he was 15 years old. And so he has to kind of use the lessons that he's learned along his journey to finally face and come to terms with that. And ultimately, it's a story about fellowship and the healing power of forgiveness. And reflected in Andrew's personal story is also the story of America And obviously, as he's walking through the South and the Southwest, he encounters a lot of what I would call America's trauma in its past, with racism and slavery and all of that sort of stuff. And so the two things kind of get paralleled and mixed together in the course of his journey.
Sounds like a very timely project. How long did that take to get into, from conception to now it's going to premiere next year?
Right. So I had met Eric just as I was leaving New York at the end of 2014. And that summer, we bounced a couple ideas back and forth, and he introduced me to this project, which initially, funny enough, was a podcast. Andrew had recorded his journey and then told it through a project called the Transom Project, which is sort of an radio producing education series, and that his story was then picked up by This American Life and aired on This American Life. And so that's how Eric had first heard about it, and he shared it with me. And then at the time, we had been approached by this company called Goodspeed, which is in Connecticut, and they have a writer's colony. And they were interested in Eric's work and said, do you have any musicals that you're working on that you would want to bring to this? And he said, well, I just started writing something. And at the time we had an outline and what is called an I Want song.
Okay.
And we pitched that to them, and they said, great, come and work on it. And so while we were there, we made our way through the first act of the play. And then the next year they asked us to come back. They wanted us to continue working on the project with them. And so we did the colony again. And then just this past January, they included it as part of their New Works Festival. So we did a full reading of both acts of the play. And then shortly thereafter, they programmed it into their season. So starting in the fall of 2014, now it's fall of 2018. So it's been about 4 years since the conception of the project. And it'll be another, 9 months before it premieres. So almost 5 years, which is pretty typical for a new musical.
That's very cool. I mean, and a lot of people will be like, oh, that happened overnight. And you're like, no, not really. Might seem that way.
Yeah, and no certainty. You're writing something, and honestly, the presentation in January was the first time that we had really seen the whole thing out loud, and the first time it had been presented in front of an audience. So even then, you don't really know what you have. You think you know what you might have, but it's not till you put it in front of people and go, oh, this is responding, or wow, they're really bored, or oh, I can see that this is landing flat, or whatever. So, so it's you just kind of you're right with your fingers crossed.
Yeah, is that kind of weird when people are performing your work, even as in a reading, just to test it, and you're like, maybe you'd cringe and be like, ooh, that doesn't work, or are you surprised sometimes when something works that you didn't expect? I mean, what's that like as just sitting back and watching people bring your work to life?
I love it. It's one of my favorite aspects of the nature of the art. It's extremely collaborative, and there is something, I describe it as something magical that happens, this sort of gossamer connection between the writer and an actor. Something magical happens, alchemical. It's like alchemy, that the piece transforms when it's being performed by actors. And so, yes, there are things that you are, you're hoping they work, or you're not sure if they work, and then they come out of the actor's mouth and they land on an audience ears, and you kind of go, yeah, okay, now I can cut that. I've now heard it aloud. If it doesn't work, I will cut it. And then there's other things that you put in your play because they just felt like the right thing, but you didn't really necessarily think too deeply about them, or you didn't understand where the impulse was coming from fully. And suddenly, when it's being examined by an actor and brought to life by an actor, you really go, oh, wow, I didn't even realize that is what I had written. But sure enough, that's what I wrote. And it is an illuminating experience. So I love that. I love, as an actor, I love actors, and I love working with actors, and I love working with smart actors. And I think it's really fun.
Well, congratulations on passing through. It's going to come to Connecticut next year, and hopefully theaters musical theaters nationwide, hopefully.
Yes, indeed.
Now, in addition to everything we've already talked about that you've got your hands in, you've also got a website called playthisforme.com. It's an online accompanist service. So what is playthisforme.com? Tell us about it.
Yeah, so Play This For Me is basically it's a site where people can go. Mostly I tailor to musical theater performers. People can upload their sheet music for auditions or for rehearsals, and I will then take it and turn it into an MP3 for them to rehearse with or perform with, as whatever the case may be. And I've also done some transcription work on there as well, various different things. But it was born out of the fact that I had a lot of people, friends and colleagues in my greater network who were asking me to do this stuff already. And so I thought, well, maybe there's a way I can just kind of not automate it, but somewhat automate the service and put it up online and serve a larger community. And I didn't know a lot about, I had a blog website, but I had to do a lot of learning about how to make forms and do payments and all this sort of stuff. So it was kind of a educational experience for me, but I enjoyed it. And now it's up in the world, and it's another thing that I do. I just got a notice about it this morning. Somebody needed something recorded. So
that's awesome. What a great service, especially for somebody as talented on the piano and as you are. But I have to tell you, websites, I have a business myself, and we just underwent a whole redoing of the website. And instead of paying somebody, I'm like, I'll figure it out. That was painful. It's good now, but the process was not fun for me.
Yeah, you learn about how much work and thought goes into making something feel seamless and intuitive.
Right.
Because we're so used to interacting on the internet, that we know how we want things to go. But then when you're having to create it and if you don't have a background in web design or even just regular old computer design, it can be very challenging. And I'm good with logic, but I'm not the most technological person. So, yeah.
Great learning stuff.
Tricky.
Yep. So we have just a couple minutes, and I want to end with a few fun questions for you. We always ask our guests, what are you watching? If I looked on your DVR right now, what would we find?
Yeah, so we love to watch Will and Grace. Modern Family.
Mm-hmm.
We love watching Modern Family. Blackish is another show that we DVR, and Meet the Press. That's usually what we have on our DVR.
Excellent. And with Thanksgiving coming up next week, Brett, what are some of the things that you're thankful for this year?
Yeah, I would like to say that I'm thankful for there are people that have taken risks, I would say, on my work in this last year and this upcoming year. And they're not, I don't know that I would look at them as risks, but I know that from a producing standpoint, people have, looked at the longevity of my work so far and decided, okay, we're going to, invest in you. And so I'm really grateful for that, because I think that is ultimately difficult for some producers to do. And yet it's really necessary for artists to kind of rise to a new level. And so I don't take it lightly when people invest in me in that way. So that's what I'm thankful for.
Well, Brett, I want to thank you so much for joining us this week. Where can we find you on social media?
I'm on Twitter and I'm on Instagram at BT Ryback, RYBACK. That's where I'm most active, so you can find me there.
And if you need some music, you can go to playthisforme.com and check Brett out on that website as well. Well, Brett, it's been fun.
Right.
Thank you very much for joining us. And good luck to you and your new musical coming up next year.
Great. Thanks so much.
My thanks to Brett Ryback for being on the show this week. He was great, wasn't he? Now, next week, we're going to go back to Broadway for a very special guest. I'm not going to tell you what show we're talking about, but I can tell you it's going to be extra cold. You can follow us on Twitter at FanCountersLive. You can also go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/FanCounters. If you want to email us any comments or questions, suggestions, guest suggestions, if you want somebody on the show that you want us to get and so you can hear, you can email hello@fancounters.com. That's going to wrap it up for this week. We hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next Friday right here on Fan Counters.
This was a podcast from the PodFix Network. You can check out more shows like it at podfixnetwork.com.